seem to want to look a little bit more at what the new voices are around the world that are in effect reacting to the fossil fuel suicide of industrial civilization. There are a group, and they're emerging around the world with a new kind of consensus, in a sense that points to the fact that we have to get beyond fossil fuels. A lot of the statements of the scientists have been foundational in this regard, and it is true that they've been out in front, way out in front, of most of the public. But that's not the case anymore, because people are seeing fracking in their backyard, they're seeing their own water supply being intruded upon, they're having doubts about the Middle East and the whole question about sustainability of extraction in other places around the world. And there have been triumphant statements about the need to move to transition studies everywhere from local school systems right through the high schools, the colleges and universities. In fact, you can see it's pretty pronounced almost everywhere these days. Take a look.
We're a fossil fuel dependent civilization, independent of what nationality we are. Our modern civilization is dependent on fossil fuels. We have to get to being a solar sustainable system. You'll admit, there's a bit of a transition, right? Transition studies are what's now in every discipline, every department, every university.
Well, they may be in some intellectual sense, but it's hardly an entire movement at this point. So we have a long ways to go in understanding and moving toward a system of, in effect, sustainable, just economies based on solar sustainability. It'll have to be the case. In other words, you can't outlast your life support system. And what we're beginning to realize is that although we're coming up with new forms of extracting fossilized fuel, we're not producing fossil fuel. We're extracting it, we're transporting it, we're refining it, and guess what? We're burning it. That is to say, we're oxidizing all forms of terrestrial carbon, whether it's coal, natural gas, or petroleum. The end product of that is that you're taking terrestrial carbon and converting it to atmospheric carbon, CO2 or methane or one of the other compounds that ends up in the atmosphere, because we've been using the atmosphere as a kind of sink. The trouble with that is that it's suicidal. There is nobody, no institution that can outlive its own life supplies, and that's where we're in trouble, because its life support system depends not just upon the oil that it can get, but the whole environment in which it lives. And that's what we need to spend a little time understanding as a group, as a collective group in a sense. It's been pointed out again and again by a whole series of scientists, so it's not new. And what we need to do is, in a sense, connect the dots. One of the most prominent scientists who point this out has been Noam Chomsky over the years, and it's worth listening to what he has to say on this, because it's really quite extraordinary and still not absorbed. He's been saying it for decades. It's worth looking at, though.
The Chamber of Commerce, the main business lobby, the American petroleum industry, other business lobbies have publicly proclaimed, in fact with enthusiasm, that they are carrying out a campaign to try to convince the population that global warming is a liberal hoax. And it's succeeded, unfortunately. The latest polls I've seen show maybe a third of the population believes in anthropogenic global warming. The media contribute in their own way. So, for example, when the New York Times runs a front-page article on what meteorologists think about global warming, namely, they don't believe it. Meteorologists are pretty faces who read scripts telling you if it's going to rain tomorrow. What do they have to say any more than your barber? But that's presented as if it's a significant contribution to the discussion.
Right, presented as if it's a significant contribution to a scientific discussion. Why? Because a weatherman was telling me. Now, the weatherman, and in fact the Weather Channel, was owned by a climate denier until he died recently, and it's really quite significant. Whether, in effect, any kind of news media, given the for and against character of news presentation, usually like one anchor here, Tweedledee and Tweedledum over here, and they go back and forth, is it this or is it that? Is it this or is it that? Never looking beyond the false dichotomies that they put forward. This is problematic because we need to, in effect, learn how to count at least to three, right? It's not just one side and the other side. What about the third side? This is something Chomsky has been putting out there for years and pointing out to us. The world has underestimated climate change. The experts point out now, because it's not either for climate change or against climate change, it's the question of how fast is it occurring. And there is dispute there. This isn't over as a debate, but the dispute has to do with the rate and pace of change, not whether it's occurring. And what we're beginning to see is that back in 2011, we already realized that the warming sheets of ice meant that we're basically going to see melting in Greenland and Antarctica, and that we finally have gotten around to measuring that. Sea levels rise from polar ice melt finally quantified, according to a 2012 article by David Schuckman. Well, it was known before that, but it's irrefutably quantified for the last 6 years, right? Well, take a look at that, because that was the end of 2012, and we still have climate deniers here. Take a look at how Chomsky characterizes them.
But what's rather interesting about this, and tells you something about the nature of our society, is that those same CEOs and managers who are trying to convince the public that it's a liberal hoax know perfectly well that it's extremely dangerous. They have the same beliefs that you and I have. So they're caught in a kind of an institutional contradiction. As leaders of major corporations, they have an institutional role. That is to maximize short-term profit. And if they don't do that, they're out, and someone else is in who does do it. So institutionally speaking, it's not a choice. That's going to happen in the major institutions. So they may know that they're mortgaging the future of their grandchildren, and in fact, maybe everything they own will be destroyed, but they're caught in a trap of institutional structure. That's what happens in market systems. The financial crisis is a small example of the same thing. You may know that what you're doing carries systemic risk, but you can't calculate that into your transactions, or you're not fulfilling your role and somebody else replaces you. And in fact, in the United States, it's actually a legal obligation to do that for corporate executives.
So, that's the institutional contradiction. CEOs have a legal obligation, a fiduciary responsibility to maximize profit for their shareholders. So they know that this global warming is catastrophic. They're not dumb. They can read. They understand the scientists understand this. But they're caught in an institutional contradiction, according to the formulation of Chomsky. And that institutional contradiction is pretty staggering. They can't afford to do anything less than maximum return, or they're ousted as the CEO. Staggering implications here.
So, and that's a very serious problem. It means that we're marching over the cliff and doing it for institutional reasons that are pretty hard to dismantle.
We're marching over the cliff for reasons that are pretty hard to dismantle. That's a characteristic Chomsky understatement. Read impossible institutionally to dismantle. People in these institutional roles, whether they're President Faust over at Harvard or the President of the United States, Obama, when he was in the presidency, knew the science. He had the best science advisor available in the English-speaking world. John Holdren was telling him to get serious about this. But he had an institutional role to grow the economy. And he waffled. He waffled down the pipeline and ultimately started saying different things to different people and had an energy policy, you'll remember it from his famous State of the Union, of all of the above. Right? Let's do all of the above. Complete collapse of responsibility in reference to a contradiction that's built into the system. This isn't just because he's a weak-minded person. It's built into the institutional structure of the system. Now, where does that leave us? Take a look.
There's other factors like the anger and fear and hostility in the country about everything carries over to this. So if you look at polls, everyone hates Congress, they hate the Democrats, they hate the Republicans even more, they hate big business, they hate banks, and they distrust scientists. So why should we believe what these pointy-headed elitists are telling us? We don't trust anything else, we don't trust them. All of this combines. The latest election a couple of days ago is you can almost interpret it as a kind of a death knell for the species. There was an article in Bloomberg Business Week, not a radical rag exactly. They're running through the new Republicans coming to Congress, and they're worried about them. One of the reasons is because they're global warming deniers, almost all. That means the powerful House committees are like science and technology and so on are going to be in the hands of people who think there's nothing to it, or at least claim that they think that. What they actually think is another story. In fact, one of them was quoted as saying, "Can't be a problem because God will take care of it." Now, if this was happening in some small country, and maybe I don't know what, Monaco or something, it wouldn't matter much. But when it's happening in the richest, most powerful country in the world, it's a danger to the survival of the species. Nobody else is going to do very much if the United States doesn't do a lot, not just some, but take the lead. So we're essentially saying, let's kiss each other goodbye.